Mastering for streaming services. So I already spoke earlier about this whole idea that we've got a bunch of different platforms that we need to deliver to, and we also have playback systems that we're trying to get stuff to translate across. Now, the delivery to platforms, even on its own, is quite a nuanced argument. The way in which music, commercial music, gets released to platforms is normally through something called a digital aggregator, a digital distributor. And so with digital distributors, their job is you give them your master of your album or your track or whatever it is, and then for a fee, they will get that master and they will get it onto everything, like all the streaming services, all the download services, absolutely everything from a central point. So the salient point here is that in most cases, there are some exceptions. For the majority of services, you're handing over one master, and that master has to serve the purposes of not just streaming, but also all of the commercial paid download services as well. So you're not giving different versions to all of these different services. You're not giving Spotify one thing and you're not giving Apple Music another thing and Tidal something else. You're giving one file to the digital distributor, and that same file has to work on all of those different platforms. It's fair to say, and industry stats show now, that pretty much the dominant platform that we're all working to now is the streaming service, the Spotify's, the Apple Music's, the whatever. That's the main game now, okay? And then all of the physical products are a much lower player now, so CDs and so on. Vinyl still has a strong niche market in indie genres, and then we have paid download services, which are now sort of narrowing down. Fewer people are actually doing the whole thing of buying and downloading tracks. Pretty much most people are moving over to a subscription service if they're a keen music listener, but people still do buy downloads. It's not like it's not there, so you still have to cater for it. It has to be available. If someone wants to buy a download of your track, your job is to make sure they can, because that's your revenue. And then there are artist-run platforms, which I'm not really going to talk about today because they are sort of outliers. So you have things like Bandcamp, artist-led download platforms. They're just a download service where you can put WAVs on them if you want to, or people can take MP3s or whatever they want. And SoundCloud, which is quite a popular platform, particularly for EDM people, but it's really low quality. The standard SoundCloud is 128 kilobits MP3, which is pretty horrible sounding. So SoundCloud is sort of popular and kind of convenient for a lot of people, but it's a bit of a nightmare from an audio quality point of view. Because streaming services are the dominant platform, that's pretty much what most people are looking at as being the number one now. So most streaming services, all of the different flavors of them, all of the different companies, they use lossy compression codecs. And so I mentioned that in the pre-record videos. That's just about getting the data stream down lighter so that it works and it doesn't consume too much of your data plan. Also, it can adapt to the quality of the connection. So, I'm on NBN at home here, no problems. I can have Spotify on full quality and it's a tiny little speck in my bandwidth. But if I'm in a marginal phone reception area and picking up Spotify off a dodgy mobile phone connection, then it might decide that it can't give me full quality on that kind of connection. And so what it does is it actually gives me a lower quality connection. So even the highest quality connection on something like Spotify is 320 kilobits per second. It's a codec called Ogg Vorbis, which is a sort of a more modern codec. But they're kind of all similar in what they do. And then Apple has something called AAC. So these compression codecs are used on all of these platforms. There's a couple of high-res streaming services that have opened that are very, very niche, and they offer uncompressed audio. And then Tidal, which is one of the main players, has a thing called MQA. They try and market it as if it was uncompressed audio. It's actually a lossy codec. It does sound better than the lower bitrate competitors, but it's certainly not a WAV file. And so they're all dealing with file compression and therefore codecs. They can go wrong or change the sound in various ways. Most of them have something called a loudness management system, which is really, really key in terms of what I was talking about before, and this is part of this move away from the loudness wars that I was talking about. Spotify is by far the biggest. It's huge. All of the other streaming services pale in comparison to the size of Spotify. So Spotify is a major target because that's where most of the listeners are. So we're going to look a little bit more detail at Spotify because of its status within the industry. So loudness management, what is it? They basically analyse the loudness of all tracks coming onto their system, and they record their loudness in Lofts, or there's a similar system called replay gain, which is actually what Spotify uses, but it's quite similar to Lofts. And then that information about how loud that track is stored along with the file, the track, on their server. And then so what happens is that on playback, Spotify and services that are loudness managed will adjust the playback level of that track according to the Lofts reading on it. So that means that I gave the example in the pre-record of the music from the 70s, well, nowhere near as loud. Then what Spotify's loudness management system is doing is that on the playback end of things, it's analysed that 70s track as being pretty soft. And so it's going to make it louder on the system. And then the latest electronica release, which has got an outrageously high lufts of something of -6, or latest hip-hop release, it's going to pull it right down. Okay, and so you can get a playlist and you could put a 70s track beside something released this year, and you wouldn't blow your head off when you went from the 70s track to the track released this year. It would adjust the loudness, but the important thing is that it's doing that on playback, and it does it within the app, and it defaults to on, but the user can turn it off. So if you've got a Spotify subscription, check it out. In the preferences on your app, you can turn the loudness management off. So that's a broad principle of loudness management. It's deployed on Tidal, on Apple Music. Most of the major platforms now have loudness management. It also applies to YouTube. YouTube has loudness management. So these systems are in place, and it's just a process of analysis, stores the information about how loud your thing is, and then when the app plays it back, or the browser with YouTube, then it'll adjust the level according to whatever its Lufts reading is. Okay, so it's a pretty nifty concept, and a lot of people have been thinking, well, this is kind of the answer to the loudness wars, is that if you make a massively loud master, then it's only going to get pulled down on these streaming services. That's kind of good in theory, but it hasn't stopped extremely loud masters from being made, because not every environment is loudness managed. And as I say, when you're distributing one file to all of the services, obviously download services, it's just files. And so if you've got someone playing back your music in a file player that doesn't have loudness management built into the file player, then you're back into competition with everyone else again, right? So until this loudness management thing is rolled out across absolutely every platform, you'll probably find that people are still going to make horrendously loud masters. And that's just an unfortunate reality. But you can see where the trend is moving. So Lufts. So there's 3 different readings. Integrated Lufts, that is the average loudness across the whole track. So it's basically has to listen to the whole track or read through it and measure the Lufts, and then it delivers you an average Lufts level for the whole track. So that includes all the soft parts and the loud parts and whatever, all averaged out together. You get an integrated Lufts. The integrated Lufts is mostly what the loudness management systems use on the streaming platforms. Then you have short-term Lufts, which is the loudness in the past 3 seconds. So you see this stuff coming up on meters. So you can see the broad dynamics of your track. Over a 3-second period, the short-term Lufts may rise and then fall, but it's all feeding into that integrated Lufts, which is the whole track. And then you have the much faster stuff, the momentary Lufts, which is only 400 milliseconds, which is about as small a window as you can get for the ears to even recognise loudness. At durations less than 400 milliseconds, our brains don't really kind of compute loudness in lower chunks than this 400. So you can think of that as just a momentary loudness. So there's 3, and you'll see these implemented on meters and everything everywhere else. But the one that is the most relevant to mastering for streaming services is this integrated Lufts figure. Sometimes they look at the highest short-term Lufts. If your track really ramps up at a certain point and gets super loud, even just for a small period of it, even though its integrated Lufts might be lower, it may decide that actually that's unacceptably loud, that one section of the song, so we're still going to pull it down a bit. So it's a fine balance, but in general terms, integrated Lufts is what you want to be looking at. So if you look at this in waveform view, so what you can see is that I've already described that the system will turn it up or down according to whatever Lufts. So if you look at the left-hand, right-hand side of this, you look at it on the vertical axis, you have a source master going into the system and then loudness manage is applied. If you have what's called a dynamic mix, so it hasn't been compressed or limited too much, so in other words, it's not that loud, the bottom line is what it will look like after it's been loudness managed. And then on the right-hand side, you have a mix going into the system that's super compressed and super limited and very loud. And then go down to the bottom, and then you'll see what happens to that once it gets loudness managed. And this is the argument for loudness management, because you can see on the right-hand side that basically all the peaks and all of the detail of that file has been stripped out from compression and limiting. And so those two tracks, when they're played through a loudness managed system, because they're both calibrated back to 14 Lofts, will be equally as loud. But the problem is the one on the right won't sound as punchy, because you'll have killed all of the transients and all the peaks in your mix, and it'll just sound a bit flat. So something that you need to think about there, when you compress or limit a mix, it does come at a cost to audio quality. There is a caveat on that, in that some musical genres, it's part of the sound for it to be absolutely slammed and compressed. You know, a lot of EDM genres, for example, the sound of the genre is just a track being absolutely slammed with a compressor or a limiter. And if you don't have that sound to it, the track doesn't sound right, okay? Heavy rock can start to approach this kind of profile as well, dynamic-wise. But in general terms, and when you're mastering and you're trying to get loudness happening, you're always listening to, is it sounding better or worse? Yes, it's sounding louder, that's all good, but, you know, beside the loudness thing, is it sounding better or worse? Because as soon as I drop this track into a loudness managed environment, then any gains that I'm making on non-loudness managed playback kind of get evened out. And so unless that track's sounding better as I'm making it louder, then maybe it's a nil-sum game. Okay, so it's quite a subtle thing. So what does Spotify do when you give them a track? It converts it to a 44.1 kilohertz WAV. And so that's why pretty much all digital distributors require you to deliver the final master to them at 44. Because the streaming services, if they don't get them at 44, then they will convert them to 44, and it's better that you do the conversion and check it than some algorithm or robot at Spotify doing it for you. And then, as I say, they'll put it into a lossy codec. This is from Spotify's own website, so these are all the different lossy codecs that it makes versions of. And then these codecs, you can see it goes down super low, right, to 24 kilobits a second. I mean, that you'd have to be on a pretty crap connection to be getting that. It'd be sounding like a tinny voicemail message or something. You can see that it makes multiple versions, and then depending on how the user connects to Spotify, then it will decide which version it gives them. Or if you're a premium Spotify subscriber like I am, you can choose high quality or whatever it is, and it will always give you 320 kilobits per second Ogg Vorbis if it can handle it across the connection. And then it calculates the loudness. So it gets it to 44.1, it transcodes it to all these lossy compression formats, and then it uses replay gain, which is like a Lofts system, to calculate the loudness. So that's what goes on when you give your track to Spotify. And then also, I spoke in the pre-record about this idea when you're mastering that you go through this process of trying to get the ballads or the softer tracks to sit softer than the loud tracks, because otherwise it just sounds weird for the ballad to suddenly be super loud, and it needs to be softer. So these loudness calculations are also made at album level. So if you deliver an album to Spotify, it will not only analyse every track and have a track-based Lofts, it'll also know that it's part of an album, and it will have an album-based calculation. So that means that if you play it as an album, the tracks preserve their relative levels. But if someone grabs any one of those tracks from your album and drops it into one of their playlists, then it reverts to the track normalisation. So in that case, the ballads would get louder. So it's quite subtle. So there's another layer called album normalisation. Because we know that Spotify and these services have a loudness reference or target, so for a lot of them, it's minus 14 Lofts. So they adjust all of their tracks to sit at a minus 14 level. And there's been a bit of movement in that in the industry over the past 5 years. So YouTube, for example, was at minus 13 for a number of years, and then about a year ago they changed to minus 14. But it shouldn't matter, because basically that's just the playback reference. You've just delivered them a file with a certain loudness profile, certain Lofts reading, and then the platform will do whatever it does because it's all relative. Everything on the platform will then get played at -14 or -13. So it's sort of immaterial that it shifts around a little bit, but it does, and it has. And then we have codec allowances, and we will talk about this in a minute when I show the relevant pre-record. When we put a WAV file through a codec, what happens is that once that file gets compressed and then it gets decoded and played back, it's actually very common for that process of encoding and decoding to add a bit of peak level. So you find that on the other side of an encode and decode on a compressed file, that your peak level may go up 1 or 2 dB. And so if you haven't allowed for that when you deliver, then you might find that you're clipping on the other side of the codec. So that means whenever you deliver to a streaming service, you have to deliver something with a little bit of peak headroom. So the guidelines, and these are Spotify's guidelines, are that you deliver to them with 1 dB of true peak headroom on your mix file. And if it's a super loud track, like a big chunky rock track or a big EDM track or whatever, and it's really loud and it's heavily compressed, then they recommend -2 dB true peak. That's just to ensure that once it goes through the codec, when it comes on the other side, it doesn't clip. So there's a specification right there. Streaming masters all need to have a true peak of absolutely no higher than -1, and for safety -2 if the track is quite loud. So somewhere between -1 and -2 dB true peak is what you need to be shooting for. So just looking across some of the various services around and their loudness management systems, Apple Music actually uses -16. So it sits at a lower level, YouTube at -14, Tidal at -14, Amazon Music at -14, and Spotify's at -14. So you can see that the industry is kind of settling around -14, but Apple Music sits a little bit lower. And this one's a real kicker. Some services only turn down, not up. YouTube does that. You'll notice that even though YouTube has a loudness management system of -14 Lofts, that there's plenty of YouTube videos that sound super soft when you play them back, right? So some services don't do the turning up, they only do the turning down. Okay, so if you deliver way under their target, then your track is just going to sound too soft no matter what. So here comes the guidelines that we're going to work to, and this is what's in the assignment. I want you to aim for, once we start looking at managing loudness with a limiter, a integrated lufts of around -14 to -12. So we know that -14 is that sort of floor of the streaming platforms. So anywhere between -14 and -12 is okay. If the platform has to turn it down by a dB or so, it's so small, it's not really a big deal. It's not like 5 or 6 dB. So if you shoot for somewhere between -14 and -12, you're in a good space for loudness for delivery to streaming platforms. The thing is, if you're trying to make super loud tracks, it's pretty hard to get it up above -12 without it really messing with your audio. It requires very skillful mastering, and so this is why pro mastering engineers exist. I mean, not only do they have great ears and great rooms for all of the EQ, but they are also extremely adept at being able to squeeze apparent loudness out of whatever track that you've given them without it damaging the audio and making it sound like it's ruined it. It's very easy to ruin tracks by just limiting them too hard or compressing them too hard so that they become louder. It's just the standard problem that people have when they're learning, and it's the skill that really defines some of the very best mastering engineers, is their ability to squeeze apparent loudness out of tracks and still have that track sound brilliant. And in fact, once we get to A-Being with the Chris Lord-Alge mix that I've been doing along the way on that rock track, that's probably $1 million record. I don't know how much they spent on that, but those sort of bands, it's like $1 million, right? So they got Chris Lord-Alge mixing it at some huge fee, and then they'll send it off to one of the world's best mastering engineers, maybe 3 or 4 of them actually, and then they'll see who comes up with the best master. So you're at the pinnacle of the production tree when you're dealing with those kinds of releases. And so, if I'm there trying to squeeze my master up and get it up here from my home setup with my near-field monitors, it's quite a challenge, right? But, you can get it close, right? But it's interesting, you see that last dB or 2, it's actually quite hard to squeeze out of it without killing the track. It requires very skillful processing just to get that extra dB or so going. And there are a number of ways that you can check it. So we're going to look at how we check loudness management, because the biggest problem is that we're sending this stuff out there and often we're not hearing what's happening to it until it's coming back off the platform. Like we've released our album and we finally get to listen to it on Spotify, then we get to hear what Spotify did to it after it left us. But there are a couple of cool tricks. I normally get my stuff mastered by a guy in the US who's in New York who has an outfit called The Ranch Mastering, Matt Agoglia. And Matt gave me this advice when I'm mixing just to kind of see how the thing's going to come up under mastering. And it's a really cool trick. If you make your WAV and you put it into iTunes, if you've got the file player iTunes, then iTunes in the preference settings has a thing called Soundcheck. And Soundcheck is an iTunes preference that puts loudness management on in your iTunes player. So what it basically does is it analyses all of your tracks that are in your iTunes playlist, and then it calculates their Lofts levels, and then it adjusts their playback levels so they normalise. Okay, so it's good. I've tried it. It works really well. I just finished an album. This is exactly what I did. So when I finished the mixes, I did mock-up masters for Matt just to say, well, this is how loud I think I can get it. I give it to him and he can do his thing. But I would then take my mastered track and I would put it into iTunes alongside commercial releases that I was referencing, turn Soundcheck on, and then I hear how they sit loudness-wise with loudness management going on. And then you can go back to the preferences menu and take Soundcheck off, and then it's just playing you non-loudness managed versions. So that's how it would sound in a download service or somewhere where people were not using loudness management. So iTunes is a killer tool for just actually predicting what will happen to your track once you put it out there onto a platform and you want to hear the loudness management. So highly recommended. It costs you nothing, iTunes is free. You can immediately hear at least what Apple's loudness normalisation will do, which is not that different to everyone else's. There's a website where you can drop your file onto it and it actually analyses what all of the platforms will do to your file once it goes out the other side. So what I might do is I might jump over to the second pre-record and we're going to start looking at the use of a limiter to get apparent loudness. And then once we're through that, then I'll open Pro Tools and we'll have a look at it on a track.